Cool. Well, welcome to the first episode of something called Digital Discourse ZA. The two people you're seeing talking today are not the founders or the originators or even the hosts of this thing. So I just want to start by telling you a bit about what this is about. Digital Discourse ZA is meant to be a platform for discussions on interesting issues by people who actually are informed on those issues, who care about them. So kind of informed interlocutors asking each other probing questions and having a discussion. We're not engaging in a scripted argument or adversarial about things or whatever. It's meant to be a sincere and serious conversation. And the founders, and you can look at their channel and you'll see some other, a launch video or rather a kind of promo video. They, and I think you and I, Al, will introduce each other in a moment, are concerned that there's a hyperbolic kind of, too many kind of trolls and grifters occupying the social media space. And this is meant to be a little bit of a turn against that. And of course, as a last introductory comment, the line between what's interesting and what's needlessly provocative is going to be difficult to draw. Sometimes you are going to stoke controversy, not us necessarily, but conversations. So please give your feedback to Digital Discourse ZA in the comments to videos and send suggestions if you think different topics should be explored and so forth. So with that said, let's secondly tell people who we are, starting with you, Al.
Oh, well, thanks for that, Jacques. And I totally agree. I think South Africa needs a space for discourse in the middle rather than hyperbolic stuff on either side. And hopefully you and I can contribute to that today. So I'm Alastair McAlpine. I am a South African trained doctor and pediatrician. I live in Cape Town. I'm currently in Vancouver for a 2-year fellowship in pediatric infectious diseases. I have an interest in sort of pseudoscience and fake medicine and stuff like that. And I write a column for Medical Brief called Digital Clubbing, which probes a lot of these issues in the sort of an online format. And I think that's sort of my claim to fame.
Excellent, thanks. I'm Jacques Rousseau. I teach philosophy and I teach critical thinking and ethics at the University of Cape Town. It's part of my background in philosophy is in epistemology, the kind of why claims are plausible or credible and why they're not, how we can assess the quality of information, but also the philosophy of science. And that's one of the things that got me also interested in things like pseudoscience. A colleague, a psychologist in the US, Caleb Black, and I wrote a book and published a book in 2016 called Critical Thinking, Science and Pseudoscience, Why You Can't Trust Your Brain. And I have for, I suppose, the last 10 or so years, been quite active in trying to combat pseudoscience and fuzzy thinking in various ways, including on metaphysics and religion and the harms that false beliefs can do more generally. And given the way we've introduced ourselves now, I think you can tell listeners or watchers rather that we share a common interest here in pseudoscience and so forth. And that's what our topic today is going to be, about why we should care about it, why we can't, in a sense, just leave people alone to believe what they want to believe. And however, that doesn't necessarily mean being antagonistic or insulting, etc., towards them. So we're going to explore some of those sorts of topics. And as Alastair said, you can find him in the Digital Clubbing column, and you can find more of my stuff on synapses.co.za and a further podcast, which actually, in fact, Alastair, I'm going to invite you on at some point, called squarebrackets.co.za. So with all that said, let's start by framing the topic. Okay, so pseudoscience and why we should be concerned about it. What's your kind of opening thought about why we actually? I mean, you're a doctor, of course, so you have to care to some extent, but I think you care independently just as a human being too. What's your reasoning for that?
Well, I think from my side, there's two main reasons why we care, and the first is sort of the obvious one, which is the stories we read in the news, which is when people don't take their child with meningitis to go and see a doctor, or a chiropractor breaks a baby's neck, or something like that. The obvious ones where we see the clear harm that pseudoscience can do to patients, to children, and that's kind of pretty obvious. And obviously, I see that a lot, and it perhaps manifests itself, and we'll talk about it a bit later, in the most extreme point in the sort of the anti-vaccination movement. And we're having an outbreak of measles in British Columbia at the moment. So that's the most obvious. And I think then the second one, which is probably more your area of expertise, but it is obviously something I'm interested in as well, is the damage that pseudoscientific thinking does to science, to the public discourse around science, and the false narrative that it builds up around science and the scientific method, and how it erodes confidence in that. And ultimately, you get then the rise of a parallel way of thinking, which at its most benign just fleeces people of their money, but at its most severe causes them to behave and act in really irrational ways that causes harm to them and to others. So I think that's kind of my interest in it. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'd certainly endorse all of those points wholeheartedly. And given that you covered many things that I would have said, I'm going to just expand or rather riff on one of the things you said. And that is the fact that, so I mean, I'm going to deviate slightly into this whole fake news sort of phenomenon and a la Donald Trump, etc. There's been a turn against authority. And the problem here is that the nuance is what I've always cared about in my writing and speaking about these things. And of course, there's a problem in authoritarianism when it comes to transmitting information. There's a problem when people are not allowed to think about things and come to independent sorts of views. So the pushback against that kind of hierarchical power structure is good, but it can go too far. And that's, in a sense, what you're alluding to, is that when you get to a point where no authority has any credibility any longer, because you've undermined the entire fabric of evidence and scientific reasoning and so forth, but by making it a completely demotic sort of thing. So people vote on Twitter for what they think is the correct remedy for your illness or whatever. Then we've gone too far. We've overcorrected. Now, if we wanted to be optimistic about this, and I mean, we probably won't have time to talk about this, but if we wanted to be optimistic about this, we might say there's going to be a correction. So we've gone too far in the one direction, now we've gone too far in the other, and in a kind of dialectic, we're going to come to a middle point. I'm not that optimistic about it because there's this, the idea of false balance has become more and more of a problem for me. And the idea that you're, in a sense, obliged as a newspaper or television station to give airtime to quacks and kooks and these harmful sorts of people because people believe in it, instead of taking some sort of responsibility for not spreading the nonsense. And the thing that people don't get is that by doing this, you are giving them the platform that they don't deserve, that they never deserved. It's not as if these things are on equal epistemic footing. You know, there's the adult table and there's the children's table, and they should be kept separate. Does that seem uncharitable to you? I always worry about being uncharitable.
I don't think it's uncharitable. And I think, you're commenting on that classic sort of Dara O'Brien riff, for anyone who hasn't seen it, if they look on YouTube, where he talks about that. And I think what social media has allowed is the sort of the democratization of views, whereby anybody on the internet can, in theory, engage with any kind of expert, and often the loudest voice wins. And my feeling is that it's actually a reaction to what has gone on before. And we've had some terrible examples in medicine in particular where the experts have got it really wrong. And I mean, the most sort of obvious example from the 70s would be the thalidomide debacle, where the drug thalidomide was given to pregnant women and there were terrible teratogenic effects on the baby, all the way to sort of the more recent Vioxx, which was a drug which was promoted as an anti-inflammatory, but then it turned out to have terrible side effects. And I think the result of that is that the public has become a bit disillusioned with expertise. And they feel like experts are no longer the go-to guys, that they have an agenda. Perhaps they've been bought by sort of a nefarious big pharma or some other organization. And so I think a lot of people feel like they've lost confidence in expertise and are now moving away from that more towards the sort of the wisdom of the crowds. Let the individuals decide, give everybody the tools, and they will make the best choice. And the problem with that, as you said, is that you then have a situation where someone who's done an hour or two of research on the internet now feels that they can go toe-to-toe with someone with 50 years of experience in a field.
Yes.
And the people looking at that think that it's an even playing field when clearly it's not. So it's difficult because we do have to shoulder some of the blame because the experts have got it wrong in instances. So it's understandable, but I agree with you. I think it's gone too far. And if expertise counts for nothing and everybody is just shouting, then the loudest voice wins rather than the sort of the most coherent.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good point. I mean these people who've done the hour of research could also have been doing it on Joseph Mercola's site or something like that. So you could be going to a source that is not itself reliable. But on the other hand, we do have reason to not mistrust, but to, as you say, to know that people have made mistakes, that professionals, that scientists have made mistakes. But the thing is that there's a self-correcting mechanism built in here. The scientific method allows those mistakes to be made, and sometimes they're corrected too slowly, and people do suffer, and people do indeed die. But that's not a valid comparison in the sense that we must remember that we should be comparing those tragedies to the absence of any science or any medicine, etc. On the whole, the system is saving lives. So you can blame Big Pharma all you like, but you can't just cherry pick the examples of tragedies and use those to besmirch entire bodies of research or fields.
Absolutely. And I think this sort of ties into, again, your area of expertise, which is bias, and how I think what's happening is that you can look up and you can almost find anything on the internet that will agree with your bias or your pre-held belief. And so I think what's happening is that people decide for whatever reason that maybe vaccines are bad, or they reject the diet heart hypothesis, or take your pick really, and they can hop onto the internet and they'll find something that agrees with them, whether it's from Joseph Mercola's site, whether it's Gwyneth Paltrow and Goop, pointing that there's stuff out there that will justify your preconceived bias. And furthermore, there will be people who will reflect back or echo back to you what you're already thinking. So then people get stuck in these echo chambers, they go down these rabbit holes, and it's very difficult to pull people back and to say, well, hey, you're missing the boat. You're losing the science.
Yeah, precisely. And I mean, the echo chambers and such are also complicated by the fact that we live in this incredibly polarized environment where somebody is lying to you is the idea, and anybody who's not part of your tribe or your grouping or whatever it is isn't to be trusted. So just asking questions or ask people to give their evidence and so forth is viewed as a threatening or an arsehole move or something like that. And then they come and try to shut you down instead of allowing for that debate or discourse to happen. Let's move on to vaccines, things that have come up quite a bit. But just as a last little note on homeopathy, because of how we were talking about how the false balance idea. I was struck twice this week. I've had to fly to Johannesburg, and reading the in-flight magazine, one of the 10 cardinal rules of flying, number 1 was pack your medicines, homeopathic and prescribed, in case of emergencies. so I tweeted at SAA, and you've got to think, what the hell are they going to help you in an emergency? How are these homeopathic going to do anything? But more importantly, why is a enormously large, bankrupt, sure, but large and influential organization for years have been encouraging the idea that these two things are equivalent, homeopathic and the prescribed medicines?
And isn't that just indicative of the normalization of pseudoscience? Because, homeopathy is one of those ones, it's not even like, ooh, there's no evidence either way. Sometimes you've got to say we've got no evidence, and we have to be humble enough to admit that lack of evidence does not equal evidence that something doesn't work. But in this case, we have plenty of evidence that homeopathy doesn't work. That question has been solved. So the fact that it can seem so normal in an in-flight magazine and no one really bats an eyelid kind of shows how we've been infiltrated. It's crazy.
Yeah, we should, of course, just caution people that even though homeopathy is completely ineffectual and does nothing and has never been shown to do anything, you can still get injured or hurt from it because it could be made in an impure fashion and contain things it wasn't, in a sense, even intended to contain. So by accident, in a sense, it could have a physiological effect, but not by design.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, as Darrow Brand said, you can always drown.
Yes. So there was a large study on the effectiveness or rather debunking anti-vaccination sentiments, again, for the umpteenth time recently. So from a medical perspective, can you talk people through what it showed or what it intended to show and how it succeeded in doing so?
Sure. So, it was a very large Danish study that took place from the late 90s into about 2011, I think. There was a cohort of over 600,000 patients. It by necessity was an observational study because, as you would know, in ethics, it's simply unethical to do a randomized control trial on vaccines. No ethics board would ever permit you to not vaccinate children. It's too dangerous. So it's an observational study where they compared outcomes in unvaccinated and vaccinated children. And importantly, and what was interesting about this study was they specifically looked at high-risk groups as well, not just normal children, but children at high risk, people at high risk for developing ADHD, autism, and things like that. And for the umpteenth time, looking at, I think, 5 million patient years, absolutely no association was found between the administration of the MMR vaccine and the development of autism spectrum disorder. And furthermore, there were no subgroups, no particular groups at risk. Children with gastrointestinal disease or autoimmune disease, for example. And it was just another nail in the coffin that vaccines cause autism. And I mean, but as studies go in this context, it's about as robust as you can possibly expect without doing a randomized control trial, which you can't do for the reasons we stated.
So if we think about this as good scientists or as lay people who are interested in science, we want to ask various critical questions here to assess whether we should actually, whether there's any reason to doubt the findings of the study. Mm-hmm. And one might be, people might say, is there something different about the Danish context that explains these results where they might not be able to be extrapolated to other contexts? Can you think of anything that might apply?
Well, I mean, given that the rise of autism over the last sort of 50 years has been well documented. Interestingly enough, over the last 10 years or so, it's actually stayed relatively constant, which goes against the autism vaccine theory. Perhaps one could argue that these children were particularly well nourished, well looked after in a system where, children are detected very early. But nevertheless, their overall rate of autism was in keeping with what we would expect from the rest of the world. So there was no change in the rate of autism. Mm-hmm. There was just no link between those who received it and those who developed it. So right. I personally, and many of my colleagues, find it incredibly robust and persuasive, especially when you put it in context with all the other studies that have shown exactly the same thing. This wasn't a result out of nowhere. This is what we've seen many times before.
Precisely, yeah. So it's in a sense that it would be a distraction for people to say that this is Denmark and perhaps this isn't true in the US, because the US rates of autism are far higher than Denmark's, but their vaccination rate isn't high, right? So you can control for these sorts of things and see that given this fairly homogeneous population, so taking a particular one like a Danish one, you would expect to see some sort of dose response. You expect to be able to observe some difference in terms of the autism and the homeopathy, the homeopathy and the vaccine, given that consistent cohort of subjects. But if you were comparing Denmark versus America, you'd have a whole bunch of different questions you need to ask and things you need to control for, etc. But those aren't. So scientific skepticism is a good thing, but skepticism shouldn't be, here I found something to nitpick in some way to artificially discredit findings that are otherwise considered completely robust.
I mean, I think there is no such thing as the perfect study, yes. Right? So if you nitpick hard enough, even the most robust studies, you can always find flaws with. And I think if you go looking for flaws, that's a good thing. But the question we want to ask is not, is the study perfect? It's that, are the results reliable? Do we have any reason to doubt the results? And I think in this instance, it's an absolutely enormous study. I personally find the results persuasive, and I don't know any serious scientists at the moment who don't. There may be, but I haven't read any real scientists who come up and said, we don't think that these results are reliable or replicable or indicative of the truth.
Yeah, and these things compound as well, of course. I mean, this confirms a bunch of previous studies. It's not like this is the first time we're getting these results. And if you have a broad evidence base, as we do here, with multiple studies confirming the same thing, the point, as you said in the beginning, is that this is simply just one of the largest, or perhaps the largest ever, and the most compelling, but it's telling the same story we've already been told many times.
Yeah. And it's also important that when we look at the so-called studies that have come out with the CDC, and there was a subgroup of African-American patients that showed a proclivity for autism in a previous study, it's important to note that there's a saying, if you torture the data enough, it will confess. If you do enough subgroup analysis of enough subgroup analysis, you can always find something. And it's important that, when you're looking at a study, that they stick to the primary objectives. Were the primary outcomes changed? Was there any reason to suspect that anything was jiggled or altered? And again, in this case, that's not the case. And there isn't any reason to suspect that there's any subgroups or anything going on here that could be influenced by big pharma or that's not trustworthy. So it's another persuasive study. I suspect the hardcore skeptics, once again, will not be persuaded. I don't think any amount of evidence will actually persuade them. But I think for anybody looking for more confirmation, it's provided it.
Yeah, I'm sure if we go back and look once this is published, we'll find comments pointing things out like that the study was actually funded by a vaccine manufacturer, that kind of thing. But that's, again, one of those things, and you and I despair about these sorts of responses, because the fact that funding might come from a source that you consider tainted doesn't necessarily invalidate the data. You need to assess the data itself, not necessarily only who funds it, right? Those are separate issues. And of course they care about this because they don't care about it simply to make money. Of course they have an interest in making money, but they actually want to save lives too. So it's unsurprising.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just saying conflict of interest, doesn't actually prove anything. If there is a conflict of interest, for me, it means you need to look at the study extra carefully. But just saying that the study was run by a vaccine manufacturer or they contributed to it doesn't invalidate everything. That would be ridiculous, because the alternative is if the government did the study, then they would turn around and say, well, it's big government, so somebody's got to pay for the study. And you can always find something if you dig hard enough about who's paying.
Yeah, and you're not going to be able to find anybody willing to spend that amount of money unless they have some kind of interest in the topic, right? It's not going to be, like some philanthropist who's going around funding research like this.
Well, even then Bill Gates does it, and then people say, well, he's got some agenda about sterilizing the planet or something, So even when that happens, people find issues with it.
Yeah, no, indeed. So one of the people we've had occasion to discuss over many years now is Professor Tim Noakes here in the South African context. And before we talk about anything to do with diet, even if we do, actually, I'm just going to backtrack slightly before we get back to that. And because we're talking about conflicts of interest and such, one thing that I'm often accused of in terms of conflict of interest is that my father's a professor of medicine and works at the National Institutes of Health. So all of my interjections in these topics is often viewed as a mouthpiece sort of thing or as a bias sort of thing or whatever. But the reason I mention that is because discussing this with him the other day, or these topics, the NIH, or American Research, now requires you to pre-register your research questions and then to report on successes and failures. So the point that you made now about torturing the data, people might have read about this in terms of what's known as p-hacking. So doing that incredibly refined analysis and eventually finding something which you weren't setting out intending to test, but you now need to justify the research funding. You need to publish, because now at our universities, at least here, you get promotions via mostly how much you publish. So people are incentivized to publish, even if it's utter garbage. They're encouraged to publish. So that's why you start torturing the data in this sort of way. So it's a wonderful move forward that we're now going to be expected to say, here's what I'm going to be testing or looking for. So you can't then retrospectively go and torch the data and find some nonsense result. That's lovely progress.
Yeah, I agree. Although there were a couple of studies done in the last few weeks by Ben Goldacre and his team, where they found a bunch of studies where the primary objective had been changed in the middle of study. They wrote to some of the flagship journals pointing this out, and the journals didn't react kindly to this information. So it's not perfect, much work to be done. But like you said, I think we're getting there slowly. And just because the system isn't perfect is not a reason to abandon it completely. And, there's the analogy, just because the aeroplane has some flaws doesn't mean you jump on a flying carpet. And just because the scientific method and the way we do it isn't perfect at the moment is not a reason to just reject it out of hand and start believing what the homeopaths tell us.
Yeah, so I mean that's all going to improve as time goes by, and we don't have time to talk about these things today. But one could talk about the publication system, the subsidy system. I mean, so as you know, the University of California has recently dumped all of the Elsevier journals, and as we move more towards that and open access and such, you'll have less of that hostile response because they have an incentive to not admit to mistakes, not to admit to having published research that isn't good, etc. So there's lots of questions one could discuss there, but obviously not necessarily for us today. So on the anti-vaccination and the Noakes thing, there's a curious thing that people do where they don't say that they are anti-vaccination. They say that vaccination is in general a good thing, but I've got some questions, and you kind of allude to the fact that maybe there's a point to Robert De Niro making an anti-vax movie. Maybe Jenny McCarthy isn't as crazy as you claiming that she is. And, all of those sorts of trying to hold the middle ground, just asking questions. So I'm not saying that vaccines cause autism, but I've got questions about it. That strikes me as an incredibly dangerous approach to the question. Do you think it's a dangerous way to approach it?
I find it enormously cynical. There's a phrase online, I think it's called, just jacking off, Jaqing, just asking questions. And the reason I dislike it is because almost always the person, it seems to me, has an agenda, and they're hiding their agenda behind the usually noble pursuit of asking questions, because generally asking questions is a good thing, and being skeptical is a good thing. But what happens is that people have an anti-vaccination agenda or an anti-something agenda. They don't want to say it outright, so they hide it behind, what's the big deal? Why are you getting so worked up? I'm just asking questions.
Yeah.
And why I say it's cynical and to people who might be watching going, well, how do you know? It's when people are asking questions on issues that have essentially been settled. And again, that will rise some people's blood pressure because they'll say, well, how can the science ever be settled? But the point is that at some point you stop doing research on questions where everyone's happy that you've got an answer, like the vaccine thing. How many more studies are we going to do on this? And when people continue to say, I'm just asking why there are no randomized control trials, or I'm just asking, are we giving too many too soon? It rises my blood pressure because it doesn't strike me as sincere. It strikes me as shoehorning your agenda in under the noble guise of, seeking knowledge.
So this, the thing is that this just asking questions, or this version of it, is, I don't know. I think it ties into the broader, perhaps conspiratorial narrative that there's information that's being hidden from you, the public. There are large corporations, there are vested interests, and that's why I'm asking these big questions that nobody else has the courage to ask or whatever. So it feeds into that kind of conspiracy narrative. And of course, conspiracies can exist, but this is one that we think you'd expect we would have found out about by now, and we wouldn't have all of this robust data saying that these things do work and it isn't a conspiracy. So you need to go down these weird rabbit holes of the conspiratorial internet to find support for this. So you'd say there's a secret CDC program that pays out for vaccine damage. And so the first time I heard this claim, maybe about 10 years ago, I go looking and they've got a web page. They're not at all secret. They've got a list of claims paid out, not at all secret. And they kind of explain that they're so worried about legal, they don't say there, but the analysis is they're so worried about legal liability that they often just tend to pay out claims and not even hear them, as a way to just make the issue go away and to placate the grieving, or the people who are upset. Sorry, my words failed me there completely.
Yeah.
So it's not as if it's an admission of guilt in a sense, which is, so A, it's not secret, and B, they don't do things that allow you to conclude that they are actually acknowledging that they are killing people or causing autism with their vaccines. So you need to pervert the evidence to believe these things that they do.
Yeah, and I completely agree. It requires cynicism and a touch of conspiratorial thinking to really, go on board that a plucky band of nutritional scientists or, naturopaths are asking the questions that nobody else does, when the reality is far more banal usually, and that the questions have been asked, they've been answered, and kind of have we kind of know what's going on.
That's right. So yeah, the other, so they kind of, there's groups of these people, and they kind of tweet at each other, and they pile up on people like you and me, etc. And the health and nutrition, well, not the health and nutrition, but the nutrition and diet world is seemingly at the moment quite full of these things. So I again saw a new Pete Evans debacle a few days ago. There's this osteopathic physician called something Tenpenny. I've forgotten her first name. Shireen or
Shireen or something, yeah.
And she, Pete Evans, the other day tweeted a link to a podcast about her, or dealing with her, where she was promoting her view that vaccines are evil and killing people and so forth. And so Pete Evans tweeted this, endorsed this view. And we've often seen Professor Noakes also retweeting and endorsing Pete Evans's views, right? Mm-hmm. So there's the other problem with this is that not only do you need to look for conspiracies, but you end up being part of a generally discredited group of people, which I think watchers of this episode of ours should be aware that if these people are all like-minded, one should have some sort of concerns around any particular member of them. And look at who they hang out with. You judge by your friends or whatever. And there's a line from that ancient text, I think it's called the Bible or so forth, which says something about that, about judging people by the company they keep, right?
Yeah.
So here it's Pete Evans, it's Gwyneth Paltrow, it's Professor Noakes, there's a bunch of these people who collectively just demonstrate a lack of judgment about these things.
Yeah, completely. And it's always problematic when you hop onto Joseph McCullough's website, and for anyone who's gone, I think it's been voted like the most pseudoscientific page, maybe after Health News or something. And on the page, you will see proudly sitting there a fawning interview with Professor Noakes, Nina Teicholz, Asim Malhotra, Jason Fung, the who's who essentially of the low carb movement. And you think to yourself, why are these doctors and researchers choosing to hang out with this guy, with this heavily discredited man, and it doesn't look good. And when you raise it with them, they go, well, we're just, putting it out there and whoever wants to listen. But, the cynic might argue that they know that McCullough has millions of followers, and so the message will go out to millions more people. But at best, it's a lack of judgment, and at worst, again, it's just severe cynicism. But really, as you say, you don't want to be hanging out with these guys, and you don't want to be pals with Paleo Pete Evans when he's talking about dairy sucking the calcium from your bones and staring straight at the sun and stuff like that, because he's not a good source. But you almost feel because he promotes the low-carb message and he's part of the tribe, they're willing to indulge him, which is really disappointing.
That's right. And it gets even worse than that. If people watching aren't aware, it was the Health Rangers site, I think, or it's McCullough's site, where they had David Icke writing for them for a long time. And this is a guy who believes that Maggie Thatcher and other leaders are shape-shifting lizards. They're aliens who live underground and come out and take on a human form, and they are running the world, these aliens, right? So you're prepared to publish
chemtrails, it's a dark hole to go down.
Yeah. But anyway, so speaking of conspiracy, I suppose we should disclose that we are actually part of a conspiracy. We're part of a cabal, in a sense. The last Noakes and Sporos book. Sporos is a person who puts words on the internet, and acts as the kind of PR machine for Professor Noakes. In their last book, they wrote about how it's actually me. I'm the ringleader. Me and Martinique.
You are. You're the big boss.
I started it. Yeah. You remember all of our clandestine meetings, I'm sure. And I think I think you are explicitly part of that cabal too. But you certainly.
I'm sure person. I'm part of the cabal.
So it's hilarious. I've met you in person once. I've met Martinique in person once, and you can probably count on two hands the number of emails and so forth that I've exchanged with both of you. But that is a way to poison the well, to discredit any criticism, right? To say that these people have a vendetta or an agenda. So in both of our cases, we're accused of being rude and ad hominem and so forth. I could have a whole hour talking about even doesn't even fit the definition of ad hominem. But anyway, insults by themselves are not ad hominem. Anyway, I'll come back to that on another day. But the fact of the matter is that if you want to look for rudeness and insult and so forth, it's almost exclusively from that side. It's just asking questions from our side and saying, sorry, that isn't clear, or the evidence doesn't support what you're saying, or do you realize that you're encouraging people to not treat their children properly because you're discouraging vaccines? People are skeptical, and you're giving them a reason. You're an authoritative source. You're giving them a reason to potentially harm not only their child, but every child, because of herd immunity, which you can perhaps define for listeners. So that's not insulting or abusive. That's the toing and froing of scientific inquiry. But the responses are, you've got vested interests, you're biased. There's things about how obese dietitians can't have opinions on things, because otherwise they wouldn't be obese, etc. So the disconnect to reality is quite astounding sometimes. So do you agree with that?
Well, totally. And I think isn't it just easier because you write a reasoned critique of them. It's much easier just to say, well, Jacques is just defending his daddy. End of. And then they can just dismiss what you have to say because you are so heavily conflicted. You're just a proxy for your evil dad. Same with me. For some reason, I hate Tim Noakes and I'm jealous, and I don't even know, what the rationale is anymore. But the point of it is, it means that they don't have to deal with the substantive issues that anybody raises if you can just automatically poison the well and say, well, clearly this is not in good faith. These are conflicted individuals with some sort of hidden agenda against Prof. Noakes, and they're so awful and conflicted we don't even have to go into what they say. We can just dismiss them from the get-go, which is lazy. It's incredibly lazy. Even if you did have a conflict of interest via your dad, or even if there was something, it still doesn't invalidate the points that you raise. And she seems kind of obsessed by the change in your surname, but it really seems to be a source of enormous conspiracy. She cannot, on the one hand, you want to protect your dad, but on the other hand, your surname's different. This is
that's part of my cunning plan. I formulated this cunning plan about 25 years ago, and it's been a long con that I've been playing here, you see. I knew that one day I'd come up against her and Professor Noakes, so I set this all in motion. Nobody was supposed to discover.
Yeah. I know you schemer, you. So for me, it's just lazy, and it's a way because they don't like it. They don't like what we have to say. I don't think they necessarily have the answers to what we're asking. And to be clear, some people might be saying, haha, aren't you guys just asking questions? But the difference, of course, here is that they're the ones who are deviating from the current scientific consensus. And so we're trying to pull them back and saying what you are saying is not in keeping with what the evidence that we've got. They don't have to deal with the substantive issues if they can show that we are just part of some evil conspiracy theory to discredit them.
Yeah, we're asking questions. We're not asking sincere questions. We're asking questions because of those agendas or vested interests or whatever. But so for people who ostensibly care about truth, like they do, it's bizarre that. So I can write. I think there were 14 mentions of me in the Law of Nutrition, the last book, and all of them are either literally dishonest, like fabricated, or have been refuted in the past, or they are misleading enough to fit the narrative of the conspiracy and so forth, so presented unfairly. So I point this out, right? But nothing gets changed and nothing gets admitted. So for people who claim to be sensitive or care about evidence, they're remarkably immune to evidence.
I completely agree, and I wrote a review on Law and Nutrition, and for a number of reasons, it's a very disappointing book coming ostensibly from a scientist for just some of the issues that you raised. You're a small part of the book, but even that small part they get disastrously wrong. And the truth is they get most of the stuff disastrously wrong, and I just get the feeling, and this is my personal opinion, what's happened with Noakes and Sporos is that they've jumped on the evangelical low-carb bandwagon. And in a sense, the Law of Nutrition is not an honest inquiry into the truth. it's a propaganda piece to back up a conclusion that they've already reached. So it's not Noakes and Sporros going, "Ooh, let's look at the evidence and come up with the best, the best conclusion to justify all this evidence." It's them saying, "We know that low carb, high fat, or the ketogenic diet, or whatever you want to call it, is the best, and we are going to go and find the evidence to back up this, preconception that we already have." And that's not good science. And that's perhaps what's most disappointing about it, is that the conclusion is preordained before you even open the first page of the book.
Right. Now, I mean, I differ from many of the critics of the low-carb movement and of Professor Noakes in, I think, being actually far more charitable to him than many people are. I still believe that he is sincere in what he's doing. And I'm not saying that you were saying it was just a marketing exercise. The book can be, but the beliefs can still be sincere. A lot of people think that it's all just a con, or that he's somehow losing his faculties or whatever. I don't believe any of that. I think he actually is fully committed to public health and to the welfare of the people he talks to, but that he just has the details wrong. But as I've always tried to say, the science is not really my interest. So you've written a review from a scientific point of view. I've always only written about argumentation and how this doesn't seem to follow from that, and the quality of evidence, etc. And for some reason, that's not considered a legitimate kind of critique. But anyway, we can't do much about that. We can just hope that the furor has died down to some extent. I think that the initial wave of enthusiasm is over, and now we're going to start seeing some. I mean, an unkind word would be grifting here. Because I got a notification the other day. He's running a workshop next week in which he's talking to people about how they should eat in the office to be better performers at the workplace. So it's basically now a motivational talk circuit sort of thing, where you plug this concept into any particular environment and collect some attendance fees. And of course, he says they go to the foundation, and that might well be true. But the point is that it's becoming an enterprise, a business, rather, it seems to me, to some extent.
Yeah. And I think it's important. Once again, I don't doubt for a second the sincerity of Prof. Noakes. I have nothing personal against Prof. Noakes. I've never met him. I think as a student once. And the critique is purely from a scientific perspective. And yet, according to all of his followers, I have some massive personal grudge, which I simply do not. That's simply not true. I don't know him, and I don't have any personal beef with the man. It's purely that I am dismayed by some of the science that he employs.
It's even worse than that, though, Alastair. I mean, I don't know if you want people to hear this, but you've had the trolls on Twitter asking how you can be allowed to be around children, right? So that you are implying that you are actually a danger to children because of this debate. And it's not as if you are feeding the children or telling them what diets they should have. So how could you be harming them in a way that's relevant to this discussion, to this debate? In a sense, it's bizarre reasoning, and it's insulting, and it's nasty, and it's distasteful, and people need to, regardless, and people are going to be annoyed listening to us now, right? Because they'll hear it as personal and vindictive and attacking. I don't think any of it has been. But if you want examples of that, the abuse that I've just mentioned being dished out at you is reprehensible. And even if you believe that you and I are completely wrong about the science here, think about what kind of a person you are and how you want to treat strangers on the internet. And if you routinely jump into a conversation with insult and abuse, I think you should take a step back and consider your life choices a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think both of us, will, in particular, you're better than I have. I've sometimes lost my cool on social media. I've sometimes tweeted and written things that I've subsequently looked back on and regret. So I'm not going to claim that I'm the most perfect, honorable, shining example of exactly how to always behave on social media. But, it certainly does go both ways. And it's really disappointing when a senior tweets something like, "I'm a blind mole rat," or, six his 120,000 followers onto you. It can be a scary experience to have furious followers of Prof. Noakes all just tweeting abuse at you. It's the dark side of social media. Yeah.
So listen, the difficulty or the danger, or one danger of living in Cape Town, is not just low carbers all over the place. It's also that currently we're again experiencing these annoying power cuts, and of course it's less annoying to some of us than to others. I can make do, and a lot of people are suffering far more than I am. But I mentioned this just to say that I don't want us to suddenly just cut out without any warning and leave the episode unfinished. So power cut could be in as little as 4 minutes. So I'm going to say thank you to all of you who watched, and thank you to Alastair for spending the time. It's been a good conversation, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Jacques. And there's so much to discuss and unpack. And I hope that people use this as a sort of a launching board to start interrogating some of their own beliefs, to start looking out for pseudoscience more on the internet, being just that little bit more critical, that little bit more open to scientific ideas, and hopefully, opening the pages up for people to add their own writing, and use it as a jumping off point.
Cool. And I'll see you at the next meeting of the Cabal.